Most small business owners don't think about HR until something goes wrong, like a bad hire, a complaint, a fine, a scary letter in the mail from some government entity. Today, I'm going to walk you through how the foundational HR setup. Most small business owners don't think about HR until something goes wrong, like a bad hire, a complaint, a fine, perhaps a scary letter in the mail from some government entity. Today, I'm going to walk you through the foundational HR setup every small business needs before that happens. So, I like to be proactive, and I know a lot of people say that they do, but you can't always be proactive for everything. And I find that some people come to me in times of distress where we need to be reactive, and that's okay. But the goal here is to really be proactive so that the things I just listed don't actually go wrong. You don't need 50 employees to need HR. I need you to hear that. If you have one employee that's on payroll, you need some HR advice. You need an HR professional in your corner to make sure you're being compliant, you're hiring the right people, and that you have the right foundations in place to not only keep that person, but to help grow your team. The risk of winging it is pretty big and can be really costly. So not just when it comes to misclassifications, but if you don't have proper documentation and you don't have an HR process, you're really setting yourself up for fines, for complaints, for things that can really go wrong. So just like you hire an accountant to help you with your finances or to do your taxes, I really recommend having an HR pro in your corner to help on the people side of things, because there's when it comes to running a business, there's so much that surrounds people, right? And with let's say you have 10 employees or under. I'm not talking about a full-on HR department. I'm just talking about systems and process, easy things that you could put into place to help you and your business grow in a sustainable way. Such a hard time saying that word. Anyone else? So let's talk about the 4 foundations that I think every small business should put in place when they begin. Number 1, worker classification. Now, I know I've talked about this before, and honestly, I'll never stop talking about it. I want everybody to be aware about how serious it is. Misclassifications can cost so much money per incident, per year worked. So if you have an employee that's been with you for 5 years, you're going to get fines and have to pay back taxes on their entire length of employment, not just present day, not just in the moment. So this is why it's really important to get your things set up correctly early on so that there's no room for error and no room for you to have to pay unexpected, hefty fines. It can be really detrimental to a small business to have to pay these things in a lump sum. And also, you pay taxes. You don't want to have to give the government any more of your money. That's your money, right? So what do I mean by worker classification? There's 2 different things I like to talk about. First, it's employee versus contractors, which I know a lot of small businesses start out with working with contractors because that's what makes sense for their business. That's what makes sense for their needs. It's usually short-term projects. They're working with contractors who have a specialty in a certain area. And so they really do need those independent subject matter experts. Contractors determine how they work, when they work, and they really follow their own process using their own experience and knowledge. With an employee, you as the business owner have control, right? So you're giving them that company email. You're telling them the times they need to be at work or online. You're directing how and when and where they're doing the work. And so from a business perspective, if you decide you need to grow your business, you probably need to hire an employee because you can really mold that person to fit into your ethos, right? Obviously, I always talk about culture fit versus culture add. Obviously, you want someone to be a culture add, bringing their own perspective and unique experience to the team so that, you have some outside perspective, right? And everything's not just coming from your head. It's always good to have that. But, you can really control the aspect of the work under your mission, your vision, your values, and really help mold people to be successful in your company. The other piece to remember is once you've determined whether somebody is an employee or a contractor, you have to determine whether they're exempt or non-exempt. So that's the other piece of classification that is super important. Non-exempt employees are considered hourly and they're eligible for overtime pay. Exempt employees are considered salary and are not eligible for overtime pay. The qualifications usually have a list of questions to ask for each role. And then also there's a salary threshold. And that salary threshold gets a little tricky sometimes because it does vary state to state, sometimes location to location. New York City has a different threshold than the rest of New York State. So you need to pay attention to where you are located for this. And then also determine based on the role specifically and then the position, the things that are being done in this role, whether this person is more of an admin or a subject matter expert. There's a professional exemption. There is an administrative exemption. So there are a few things to pay attention to when determining the classification. If you are truly unsure about which one the position is, and again, this exempt, non-exempt, salaried or hourly, is tied to a role, not to a person. So it really matters what the needs are for the role, not an individual. If you really are on the fence and you're like, it could go either way, to err on the side of caution, I would always go with hourly because, that's really what they're, should you ever be audited or should anybody complain, what they really want to make sure is that people are getting fairly paid for the work that they're doing, which includes being paid overtime should they work over 40 hours in a work week. There are also different overtime laws per location. California has different overtime laws than New York does. So there are some nuances there. These are things to be aware of and take note of while you're getting these positions together and making those offers. So the next step is obviously you need to be able to pay people, right? How are you going to do that? I've had people come to me and say, I just Zelle them. And that makes me so nervous. I'm all about doing things that are scrappy to get started, right? I totally understand how you have to, do what you need to do as a small business owner. But getting a payroll system set up can be super, super easy. Generally, when I work with small businesses, I like to hear about what their needs and requirements are first before recommending the right payroll system for them. I do work with a ton of different systems and have throughout my 14-year career, so I do have a general understanding of what fits people's needs. So I would, really recommend getting with an expert, asking their opinions, letting them know what you're looking for. A lot of these systems do super basic payroll processing. I always recommend that you do your onboarding flow through your payroll system, that you make sure that it can accrue sick time, that it can, add in any PTO days, that you can upload documents to your employees' individual profiles. I think that's incredibly important so that you're not dealing with employee files elsewhere. A lot of these systems also make it really easy to manage I-9s, which I have a whole nother video about that. That's a really, really important thing to not only fill out correctly, but store correctly. And these systems make it really easy to do that. So those are some of the things that I personally look for in a system, but there's so many capabilities out there. If you offer or want to offer any sort of benefits, make sure that they integrate with the system of your choosing. If you need scheduling or time tracking, making sure that that's up to your standards. So, that's definitely something I work on evaluating with my clients, but, do your research out there if you're doing this on your own. Basic payroll setup is just so important so that you're getting people paid correctly on time and that there's, pay stubs and a trail of all of it. A lot of these systems will do the W-2s at the end of the year. People can download them right from their portal. Anything that takes out any sort of manual back and forth or manual process for you is what my recommendation would be. If you need some recommendations for payroll systems, just, DM me in the comments and I can definitely help you with that. So, with also the payroll systems, they have a lot of reporting capabilities as well, which is also beneficial for businesses everywhere. The third thing you really need is basic documentation. So to me, what that looks like when you're starting to hire, documentation to me is considered offer letters, job descriptions, I-9s, a record of employment, basically. Your offer letter really needs to clearly state the job title, the start date, who they're reporting to, how much they're being paid, whether they're exempt or non-exempt, whether they get any sort of benefits. So anything that's related to pay, first pay date, benefits do count as total compensation. So make sure you're including that in an offer letter as well. Even if people are just eligible for, paid sick leave in the state that you're located, like New Jersey has paid sick leave, put that in the offer letter that they're eligible for that. If you have health, dental, vision, that all goes in there. If you're giving PTO, put that in your offer letter. I would recommend it being a document, not just the body of an email, and the employee should sign it so that there is a record of understanding that this is what's agreed upon. This should go into their employee file. And if you set up a great payroll system, you can do those onboarding flows through there. So super easy, all in a system for you. Job descriptions are so important to me. They're one of the most important pieces of documentation that you could have in your business. It's not just for hiring purposes. It's for setting the expectations with the team members. So even after somebody started, right? You have an employee that applied for a job and they look at the job description then and they say, great, I want to do it. I can do it. Let me apply. Then they don't see the job description most likely ever again. What I always recommend doing is reviewing that job description with that employee on their first day so that you have a standard of what's expected in that role. If there are some things they're not going to get to for a period of time, that's okay too. Let them know we're going to start this at the 6-month mark and check in on that job description with them as you're going through some more formal check-ins. It's just a really good way to level set expectations from both parties. And then another piece of basic documentation, obviously the I-9s, which, I've talked about so many times. Make sure they're done correctly on time. That's within 3 days of the start date, that they're filed correctly, that all sections are filled out correctly, and you'll be fine. You'll be absolutely fine. So that's the basic documentation in the beginning of someone's employment. The last thing is a foundation for written policies. So Even a one pager beats absolutely, nothing. But I do say once you have one employee, you should have an employee handbook. And I know a lot of small businesses, especially if you've never worked in a corporate environment, you might think it's not necessary, or, I'm a small business, I don't need that. And I'm here to tell you that is not true. Unfortunately, employee handbooks are incredibly important. They list out all the policies, not only from like a legal perspective, right? Like your discrimination, harassment policies, your code of conduct, like all these things that are really necessary and required. But they also allow you to make decisions for your own business. Like, what does that PTO policy look like? Do you offer things like bereavement time off? Is there a really fun, unique policy to you? I work with a lot of retail stores, and one of them has a really generous benefit of providing employees an annual sum of money to spend on the clothes in the shop. And that's a policy that's written in their handbook. So think about what makes your business unique, and you can create policies around that too. What this does is it not only helps your team understand the expectations, the process, the rules, the regulations, it also protects you a little bit more because you have policies in place that you can refer back to. But also it helps you keep a standard for everyone. I worked with a business who, just hired their first set of employees, and they had someone come to them and say, hey, I'm pregnant, which was great. And the business owner said, take as much time as you need. And it was a very loose conversation. There was nothing in writing. The employee took way longer than the business owner expected, but they dealt with it. The next time a person, was pregnant within the company, that business owner had a really tough time figuring out how they can put a standard in place because they felt taken advantage of the last time. So having a policy really helps a business owner, you, put these standards in place for the team and to treat everyone fairly. So if they had a policy that said 4 months of paid leave, they would be able to just tell that next person the same thing. So, really keeping that standard set for everyone so that there's no unfair treatment happening, whether it's, favoritism or the fact that maybe, somebody feels like they got lesser of a deal because you might not like them. This takes out any of that. So I really, really recommend having an employee handbook, having it signed by the employee either prior to their employment or the first week. And again, if you have a great payroll system, you can do it through there. You can have them sign it through there and store it through there. So once those basics are kind of in place, those are really the basics, I really recommend creating a really solid onboarding process so that it's the same for every employee, that their first week is scheduled out, not overscheduled, but scheduled out enough so that they feel supported, they know where to go for things, they're learning, they're, having a great time and invested in your business. The worst is when you start a new job and you're unclear of the expectations. You don't know when you're supposed to sign on, or you don't know what the dress code is. You don't know if you should bring lunch, or are you going out to lunch, or is there a cafeteria? You don't know where the bathroom is. So make sure that you're providing people with a somewhat structured first week, and that you as the leader are doing check-ins with them regularly. Performance management is obviously, a big part of what comes next. Now that you have employees, you're going to have to work with them on their performance. Regardless if they're the best employee or not, they're going to need your guidance. So what does that look like for you? How is that manageable? And, I do have a really great 3-month project that I do with small businesses that cover all of these things. We work on a category per month, and by the end of it, I have businesses set up with job descriptions for every role, with payroll systems. We do the evaluation. I project manage the setup and get people ready to go. They have a solid onboarding process through those payroll systems, and they have an employee handbook with their own unique policies as well as what's required. My 3-month projects can really be tailored to fit a business's needs, and it's super fun to get to work with these businesses who are just hiring for the first time. So if you're not sure where your gaps are, that's exactly what I help founders figure out. The link is in the description to book a 90-minute intensive or learn more about working together. I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you next time.